Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Holy cow, is it cold out there? I couldn't believe it. You know, I grew up in South Dakota, and this was normal weather, but I'm too soft. I mean, anyway, I'm so glad that all of you persevered and came, and we're really delighted to have you here. I look forward to this conference that we do jointly with JETRO. We've been doing it since 2005, you know, for almost 20 years. And I think it's really been a extremely important venue because, you know, it's really accompanied the way in which Japan has transformed itself. And it's now, you know, in many ways, the normative rule maker, you know, in Asia. It accepts the standard. It establishes, I should say, standards of commerce now. That was not the case 20 years ago. And the high point, I think, was, of course, when Abe-san decided to move ahead with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you know, after Trump pulled out of it. And that really marked Japan being the leader in Asia, and that old big brother, little brother thing got reversed, you know, and I was really happy for that because it showed that Japan was leading, and it's coming at a time when there's this kind of also a strange evolution in our thinking here in Washington. I mean, it started it's been going on for 10 years, this kind of technology protectionism that's become more prominent in our economic policy making. And now we have this huge trade thing going on with President Trump. Don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do, you know, but it's not going to stop, you know, this administration's desire to use, you know, 17th century techniques for 21st century problems. It just feels to me like this is going to be a shared problem that we have with Japan. And so we're going to explore a lot of, you know, this today. And I'm so grateful that we have an opportunity to do it with such thoughtful people. And we had a fascinating dinner last night talking about all of it, and it's really going to be a great conference today. My job really is, in addition to welcoming you, is really to introduce to you somebody you already know. That's Dan Crittenbrink. I mean, it's like, you know, like nobody here knows who Dan is, but we're delighted that Dan has joined us. He flew in on a red eye, to get here. So if he falls asleep during his speech, you all know why. Okay, but it's really went out of his way to really accommodate this. And of course, Dan, it's emblematic of his long history in public service, and we should all say thank you to you for having, you know, you are ambassador in Vietnam. You were the desk officer for many years in the National Security Council, became the assistant secretary for East Asian Affairs, and now you're at the Asia Group and one of the leaders there. And so it's really, you're still in service, and we're delighted that you are. So would all of you, with your warm applause, because it's too cold, warm applause, please welcome Dan Crittenbrink up to the stage.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's truly my great honor to speak at this important event today regarding the U.S. Japan Economic Partnership. And yes, I did fly in on a red-eye flight from San Francisco because I really wanted to be here. And I think it's a great event. I want to convey my particular appreciation to CSIS, especially Dr. Hamre and Dr. Gavella, for inviting me. And Dr. Hamre, I continue to have profound respect and admiration for you and this institution that you've built, as you continue to play a central role in supporting, growing, and nurturing the U.S.-Japan alliance, which truly remains the cornerstone of regional and global peace and prosperity. I also want to thank JETRO Chairman Ishiguro for your and your organization's critical role in supporting bilateral economic cooperation and strengthening the U.S.-Japan partnership overall. Very nice to meet you today. As Dr. Hamre noted, I really am delighted to join you here this morning. I'm now a partner at the Asia Group, where we help clients, including Japanese clients, navigate the intersection of geopolitics and corporate strategy. But in my heart, I think I remain a diplomat who had the extraordinary privilege of working on the U.S.-Japan alliance on multiple occasions across my 31-year diplomatic career. And over the course of my many assignments, I learned a few maxims about the U.S.-Japan alliance that I think still apply today. Ambassador Mansfield, of course, famously said that the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship is the most important in the world, bar none. I think that still remains true. I also remember being inspired by Ambassador Richard Armitage in the early 2000s by his declaration in Tokyo that he represented a generation of Americans prepared to commit their lives to our alliance, based on the belief that the alliance was the best means of ensuring peace, deterring war, and advancing prosperity in both the region and the world. And I think that same spirit is required today to continue strengthening our alliance. And I've been amazed at the evolution of our alliance over the past 3 decades. We successfully overcame trade frictions, doubts about the post-Cold War relevance of the alliance, challenges over U.S. basing and roles in missions, and impediments to bilateral planning to ensure that our two militaries could actually do the work together to ensure not only the defense of Japan, but the maintenance of peace and stability regionally and globally. I recall just last year, a year and a half ago, together with my many Japanese counterparts, I marveled at during the state visit of former Prime Minister Kishida, just how far the U.S.-Japan alliance had come. I think our challenge today remains to sustain this upward trajectory in our alliance on which our two countries' security and prosperity still depend. The alliance remains as important as ever, and the bilateral economic relationship remains just as critical, supporting mutual prosperity, resilience, and innovation. In every instance, we've managed to continue this progress by enhancing strategic trust, strengthening our shared vision for the kind of region and world in which we want to live and prosper, focusing on concrete steps to advance that vision and overcoming difficult challenges. And I think that joint painstaking work remains as important as ever. Now, it is no newsflash to say that this first year of the second Trump administration has been a complex and challenging one for the alliance, particularly on the trade front, marked by ups and downs, but ending, I think, on a relative high note here at the end of 2025. And despite a promising start with a home run visit to Washington in February of this year by former Prime Minister Ishiba, the relationship quickly thereafter grew tense, and levels of concern in Tokyo rose to what I thought were unprecedented levels as President Trump's first months in office were focused primarily on disruption and generating leverage, particularly through the tariffs launched on the April 2nd Liberation Day. Even as new tensions also arose in the security alliance over pressure to increase defense spending and potential changes at that time being discussed to U.S. force posture, leading to cancellation of the Security 2+2 for perhaps the first time ever. Some friends in Tokyo earlier this year wondered why not only did there no longer seem to be a preference for America's allies, but allies seemed to be singled out for punitive economic measures. And yet, standing here this morning in Washington in December, I think we've observed a significant shift on the part of the Trump administration in recent months towards deal-making and stability, as represented by the U.S.-Japan trade and investment deal and the President's recent travel to the region, including his very successful stop in Tokyo. I think our Japanese friends deserve significant credit for the proactive and flexible approach that they've adopted towards trade negotiations with the United States. And the resulting trade deal has clearly benefited both countries. While I think it might be hard to say that friends in Tokyo are pleased with 15% tariffs, I do think there is a certain sense of relief and satisfaction that a deal has been hammered out that serves both countries' interests and mitigates the most harmful effects of tariffs, particularly as the region as a whole has settled in to a relatively uniform 15 to 20% tariff band. The U.S.-Japan trade and investment deal advances each country's prosperity and economic security while also supporting the President's goals to bring critical investment to the United States, removing barriers for the U.S. auto industry, and facilitating agricultural, energy, defense, and aerospace purchases. From a commercial perspective, Japan's landmark $550 billion investment pledge provides critical resources and momentum to private sector initiatives in key sectors, ranging from AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing to critical minerals, energy, and pharmaceuticals. I believe there's also clear enthusiasm from the private sector, as shown in the number of executives who engaged in the President's trip to Japan and the projects that the governments highlighted during that visit, particularly, again, in energy, AI infrastructure, and critical minerals. And of course, organizations like JETRO are well positioned to support Japanese firms and their U.S. partners in navigating opportunities that align with those priorities. Now, in addition to this turn towards stability and deal-making that I think we've observed, it has also been encouraging to see the development of the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi. Ever since at least the Ron Yasu relationship in the 1980s, the relationship between the U.S. President and the Japanese Prime Minister has obviously been crucial to the smooth functioning of the alliance. Building on the success of the Trump-Abe relationship, President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi appeared to have quickly established a strong and productive relationship of their own. The President's October visit to Tokyo really was highly successful. It appeared to showcase the clear alignment between the two leaders and their vision for the relationship, and was bolstered specifically by Prime Minister Takaichi's emphasis on further strengthening Japan's defense and expanding its role in the alliance. The Prime Minister established her own credibility as a counterpart at an early stage in her tenure, while the President emphasized the strength of the alliance and his desire for a strong relationship with the Prime Minister. I thought the visit was particularly striking because it appeared to represent a return to a more traditional approach to the alliance on the part of the President. And in addition to a signing ceremony for the U.S. Japan Trade Framework Agreement, the leaders were able to announce several landmark initiatives, including a framework for securing critical minerals and rare earth supply chains, with mining and processing as key areas for cooperation. A new technology prosperity deal that aims to promote collaboration in the strategic science and technology areas was also signed, including AI, biotech, fusion energy, quantum, and space, with an emphasis on building integrated innovation ecosystems, shared standards, and promoting U.S. and Japanese exports. And I think these initial interactions and announcements have set up the President and the Prime Minister to have a very productive relationship in the years ahead. But my view is nothing comes easy, including in the U.S.-Japan alliance. And our alliance cannot and will not function on autopilot. We must work every day at both the strategic and tactical level to strengthen it and overcome shared challenges, both in the security and the economic and trade domains. Our alliance will need to continue to navigate the volatile and uncertain geopolitical landscape of the 21st century, as well as the complexities of domestic politics and economics in both our great countries. Now, for Washington and Tokyo, it's obvious that China remains a significant and multifaceted challenge requiring careful alignment and communication, I think more than ever before. As the Trump administration pursues a tactical stabilization and fragile truce with China, it is critical, in my view, that Washington and Tokyo remain aligned, and that this rapprochement not come at Japan's expense. Japan has faced an intensive pressure campaign from China, ostensibly related to the Prime Minister's recent remarks on Taiwan, that appears designed to intimidate and shape the new Prime Minister early in her term, while also trying to drive a wedge between Washington and Tokyo. As has always been the case, and as I know from painful personal experience, the United States has always played a key role in deterring escalation in the region, and I believe that the United States should do more to ensure current tensions do not spiral out of control. China's actions only provide more reason for our two countries to pursue shared initiatives to strengthen our economies, resist coercion, shape our technological futures, and realize our shared vision for a peaceful and secure region. Now, turning briefly and more squarely to the topic of elevating the U.S.-Japan economic partnership, I believe that implementation of the tariff and investment agreements by both of our governments is probably the most important thing we can do in the year ahead, and that includes the selection and launch of priority projects beginning in early 2026. Opportunities under consideration will obviously need to have clear benefits for Japanese companies to be successful. Reinforcing leader-level and ministerial engagement is also critical to sustaining political momentum, guiding implementation of agreements, and maintaining unity in addressing regional economic challenges, especially as Japan navigates the heightened tensions with China that I mentioned a moment ago. I also believe that in the year ahead, it should be a priority to revive the U.S. Japan Economic 2+2, along with the regular convening of the Security 2+2. Tokyo and Washington can leverage this year's technology prosperity deal to support more intensive coordination on a range of critical sectors to both our economies. Steps may include better aligning standards, supporting resilient supply chains, and incentivizing joint innovation. And I believe our two sides should also promote constructive engagement with other partners, as well as with other multilateral and minilateral groupings, including the Quad, thereby leveraging the U.S.-Japan alliance to support regional stability and uphold shared principles of openness, transparency, and a rules-based economic order. And finally, something that I'm very passionate about in both of our countries, I think it's vital that we continue to grow support for people-to-people exchanges that remain such a foundational element of our alliance, whether in education, between our officials, or among our workforces. I believe that only by redoubling our commitment to the alliance and by ensuring a focus on a meaningful, productive, and equally beneficial partnership and via true strategic alignment can the United States and Japan achieve a golden age of economic partnership that extends beyond any one administration, benefits both our peoples, and contributes to regional and global peace and security. Thank you very much. Would you like me to take a question? Christy has volunteered me to take a question or two if anyone would like to lob something at me. I feel like going out on the high wire today, and if no one is brave enough on this cold, wintry morning, that's okay too. Any brave souls? Going once, going twice. Here we go, please, ma'am.
What would you recommend? What would you recommend as first step if you want to proceed forward? I mean, the hardest thing is getting started, right?
What's that?
What would you recommend as the first step or steps? Say, like next year, we should be doing this as a priority.
On the economic side, on the alliance in general? Well, as I mentioned, if we're talking about the economic and trade relationship and the investment agreement, I think making sure that we stay on track and implement it would be step one. I hope we can continue to look for opportunities for our leaders to meet in the year ahead. As I mentioned, I also think we should revive the Econ 2+2. I think it's a really important body that particularly gets at the economic security issues that I think are maybe more important than ever before, especially in the context of the ongoing tensions between China and Japan. That would be my short list to start with. But thank you for your question. Anybody else? All right, well, I truly am honored to be here. Christine, Dr. Henry, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you again, Ambassador Crittenbrink, for those opening remarks. They're clearly comprehensive and addressed all questions preemptively. So my name is Christy Cavella, and I am Senior Advisor and Japan Chair here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing Mr. Norihiko Ishiguro to you today, and he'll be our next speaker. Mr. Ishiguro is Chairman and CEO of the Japan External Trade Organization. After graduating from the University of Tokyo, he joined the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, where he spent 35 years working in trade, industry, energy, and other policy areas. During his distinguished career, his roles included serving as Vice Minister of Economy, Trade, and Industry for International Affairs, where he was involved in selling quality infrastructure to emerging economies and negotiating mega free trade agreements, such as the U.S. Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Immediately prior to his appointment as JETRO Chairman and CEO, Mr. Ishiguro was Senior Executive Vice President of NEC Corporation, where he was responsible for formulating business strategies to respond to major economic and social transformations brought on by new technologies. So we're so grateful to have JETRO as a partner for this event, and I'm so pleased to hand the floor off to Mr. Ishiguro.
Yeah, thank you very much for kind introduction, Christy-san. So thank you very much for joining us today. So I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Hamre, the President and the CEO of the CSIS, and all the CSIS staff for their efforts in preparing today's seminar. Since 2005, we have continued to hold this CSIS JETRO seminar, focusing on trade and economic integration in the Indo-Pacific region. Selecting the theme this seminar today was really challenging. Compared to the previous one 2 years ago, uncertainty in the global economy and policy environment has risen sharply. That has a significant influence on corporate activities and investment decisions. The traditional multilateral free trade system is also being forced to redefine itself as a response to the climate change, rapidly evolving AI technologies, and geopolitical tensions continued to shape economic policies and corporate strategies in today's world. In this era of change, a critical question we face is who will redesign the rules of the futures, advancing them while building trust? The answer is clear. In the Indo-Pacific region, as a partner that share both values and responsibilities, Japan and the United States stand as the only robust alliance capable of demonstrating new order to the world. As a member from the academia, industry representative, and the trade promotion agency like ourselves gather here today in Washington, D.C., I would like for us to reflect on deepen the discussion on what each of us can contribute to the three critical challenges demanding a strong Japan-U.S. collaboration, namely strengthening the resilience of the supply chain, ensuring economic securities, and building a new trade order in the Indo-Pacific region. First, one of the greatest challenges is strengthening supply chain resilience, is how to maintain and enhance the competitiveness of the U.S. domestic production. Japan is the country with the highest investment commitment in the United States, with nearly 9,000 Japanese affiliate companies operating locally and supporting close to 1 million jobs. The cumulative investment has exceeded $800 billion US dollars, making Japan the largest investor. Moreover, according to the JETRO's latest survey, nearly half of the Japanese companies indicated plans to further expand their operation in the U.S. over the next 1 to 2 years. So we can expect this strong investment momentum to continue. On the other hand, U.S. domestic production faces intense competition, particularly in cost structure and talent acquisition. According to the JETRO survey, long-standing management issues for the Japanese companies operating in the United States include rising labor wages as well as a persistent difficulty in securing talent with the required skills. A prime example of addressing these challenges through the cross-Japan-US cooperation can be found in the semiconductor sector, where Tokyo Electron and Micron Technology have forged an industry university partnership to support the development of the next generation industrial talent in the United States. The contribution of the Japanese companies towards strengthening the U.S. industrial base is indispensable for building more resilient supply chain across the Indo-Pacific region. Addressing the second challenge of building the solid foundation for the economic security also requires close cooperation between Japan and the United States. Today, economy and security have become inseparable. In particular, it is essential to accurately identify vulnerabilities and establish a cooperation framework that ensures a sustainable and stable regarding supply chain bottlenecks, such as critical minerals and rare earth. At the Japan-US Summit meeting held in Tokyo in this October, our two countries signed a framework agreement to secure the supply of the critical mineral and rare earths. In addition to the strengthening supply chain resilience, this initiative aims to build a multi-layered supply network for strategic resources through the enhanced cooperation with like-minded countries. JETRO also intends to contribute actively in this area, particularly by promoting collaboration between Japanese and U.S. companies. And the third point is the creation of the new trade order in the Indo-Pacific region. Our goal is not to exclude any particular country. Rather, it is to present Asian and Pacific countries with the option of the free, open, transparent, and sustainable growth model. In this regard, Japan proudly considers itself occupy the most important position. According to the latest survey report, State of the Southeast Asia, by IC's Institute of the Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore leading think tank, 67% of over 2,000 ASEAN experts identify Japan as the most trusted country, placing it at the top of the 7th consecutive year. Japan is a member of the RCEP, which includes not only China, U.S. largest competitor in this area of the economic security, but also ASEAN, growth center of the Asia, as well as Australia and South Korea, U.S. allies in the region. Moreover, Japan played a pivotal role in finalizing the CPTPP, which has set high standard trade rules. And of course, Japan remains the most important ally of the United States in Asia. When the United States seeks a growth model in the Indo-Pacific that is free, open, transparent, sustainable, could there be any partner more important than Japan? The message that Japan and the United States should take the lead in building new trade order in the Pacific may not necessarily enjoy strong support here in Washington, D.C. today. While the U.S. pursued its own agenda of the bilateral negotiation to strengthen the ties with individual countries, Japan can leverage its existing frameworks to facilitate and support mechanisms that enable future co-creation initiatives between Japan and the United States across the Indo-Pacific. Having earned the trust of the Indo-Pacific countries, Japan must now collaborate with the other regions, including Global South countries such as India, Brazil, South Africa, and the Middle East partners. I firmly believe that seizing golden opportunity in these rapidly growing emerging markets is also indispensable for sustainable growth of the Japanese companies. With regard to China, some people have a concern about the current situation between the U.S. and China. So, position of the government of Japan is to comprehensively promote a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests and build constructive and stable relations. Through the level-headed dialogue and stable economic relations, Japan will thus advance regional stability and prosperity. Lastly, after having outlined Japan's determination and commitment in the Indo-Pacific region, let me re-emphasize that Japan and the United States shape a strong relationship of the trust spanning over 60 years. As I mentioned earlier, Japan has supported growth across every major industrial sector as the largest investor in the United States, from automobile, pharmaceutical to IT, renewable energy, and data centers. The significance of Japan's investment goes beyond its economic contribution. Each company has worked alongside local communities, investing in their future by partnering with schools and the local NPO. In the regional cities across the U.S., Japanese companies have built good corporate citizenship that go beyond employment to include education, vocational training, and cultural exchange. JETRO takes pride in having supported the development of these grassroots ties between Japan and the United States. In the light of the growing demand for the corporate investment to strengthen the supply chain and ensure economic security, I firmly believe that this is the best moment for Japan and the United States, particularly our companies, to usher in a new golden era. By taking change and opportunity, we can show the Indo-Pacific, the global South countries, and the world a reliable path towards growth. Today, we are honored to welcome most distinguished experts of academia, as well as a representative from industry and think tank, to these important discussions. I believe our shared responsibility now is to continue delivering without hesitation policy recommendation for the Japan and the United States to work together in the strengthening supply chain, which will enhance America's industrial competitiveness and build a new trade order in the Indo-Pacific. I hope that today's seminar will help all participants reflect on how Japan and the United States can strengthen their strategic relationship, achieve sustainable growth. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who's joined us here today. As was mentioned by both of our opening speakers, it's been quite a whirlwind of a year for the Indo-Pacific region and for the world. Just looking at the Indo-Pacific, we've seen new governments in a number of other countries, including the U.S., where we transitioned from the Biden administration to the second Trump administration. In Japan, over the last year or so, we've seen the transition from Kishida to Ishiba and now to the Takaichi administration. And with these political transitions, they've in some cases brought significant changes in economic policy, particularly with the U.S., where we've seen, as has been mentioned, the rollout of an extensive set of tariff policies and the negotiation of a number of new deals across the region in terms of things like critical minerals, technology prosperity deals, all kinds of other things, including between the U.S. and Japan, which I'm sure we'll discuss today. And these changes have in turn spurred a lot of debate about the state of regional economic developments and where the region might be going in the future. So today we're delighted to have a fantastic panel of experts to look at these regional economic developments from a variety of perspectives and at the potential for the U.S. and Japan and perhaps other partners to adapt their economic partnerships and relations to new political conditions and to try to understand how they can move forward in this new environment. So just to briefly introduce our speakers, I can't comprehensively cover all of their accomplishments, but we are joined today by Mr. Robert D. Atkinson, who is founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and a widely published author on the economics of innovation and policy surrounding new and emerging technologies. Also by Mr. Shea Wester, who is director of Asian Economic Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And he was previously at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council in Singapore, where he led policy strategy and programming across a variety of industries. And then to his left, we have Professor Tsuyoshi Kawase, who is a professor in the Faculty of Law at Sophia University and a faculty fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade, and Industry, RIETI, in Japan. And his area of expertise is international economic law. And then to his left, we have Ms. Barbara Wiesel, who is a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. She recently retired as a managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, and she previously had a career serving in government at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and the Department of State, including serving as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, during which time she was the U.S. Chief Negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and led bilateral FTA negotiations with Malaysia and Thailand. So we have a truly impressive breadth of expertise on the panel today. And so to start, I'd like to ask each of our speakers a couple of questions to help us set the scene for the discussion. And I think we've already gotten off to a great start with our opening speakers. So if I could start with you, Barbara. So how do you see U.S. economic policy evolving over the past year or so? What's your take on things? And where do you think we stand after the wave of regional trade deals that's been negotiated by the Trump administration?
Well, thanks for having me, and I appreciate being part of this important program. I want to start by saying I think what we've seen over the last year was an overturning of many decades of trade policy, and so it isn't sort of an evolution. It was a clear break with anything that we've seen in the past. And so as we look at what happened since January 1 or since the tariffs were first imposed, I think what we have is observed is a number of things. The first is that the administration really carefully calibrated the leverage that it had over each individual trading partner. You know, it really thought carefully on all of the elements of leverage that it had, and then it had a list of priorities with each of those countries, and then it applied precisely the amount of pressure necessary to get those countries to agree to the U.S. demands. And we've seen that in country after country. But we also have seen some patterns as we look at what's happened over the last several months. And the first is that while the agreements differ, we do see a template. So the administration in the dozen or more agreements that have been reached, whether they're final agreements or whether they're framework agreements, have similar elements. And so, you know, you've seen tariffs and non-tariff barriers, economic security elements, and I think an interesting part for trade wonks like me is the dispute settlement elements where there isn't traditional dispute settlement. The U.S. retains leverage on its trading partners, keeping that sort of Damocles kind of hanging over all of the trading partners. And all of the agreements include those elements. But there also are differences. We have different commercial deals that were reached, you know, that reflect the commercial or strategic significance of the particular partners. And, you know, interestingly, reflecting how hard some of the individual countries pushed back on the demands made by the United States. So some of the countries seem like they recognized they had very little leverage for economic reasons, commercial interest or national security reasons, and basically accepted U.S. demands. I think Japan pushed back on some elements at least, and that's reflected in the final deals. I think you've seen the Trump administration be somewhat sensitive to the market reaction and willing to adjust a bit. There was this period several months ago where everyone was talking about TACO. It isn't really TACO that we've seen, although there were specific issues on which there were TACO moves. But the administration has been sensitive to the market reaction and increasing concerns about inflation and jobs and things like that. So I think that's something that, in terms of the evolution of the policy and where we see it going. On the other hand, I will say Trump himself and many of the senior advisors have really stuck to the path and have dismissed the criticism that the tariffs are the cause of what we're seeing. So I think, in terms of where do we see things going, some adjustments to the policy, but they believe in what they're doing and they believe that it's successful. I think the investment commitments made by Japan, Korea, and the EU are an important element of what they expect to be benefits of these agreements. And so I think while there is some flexibility and it isn't quite TACO, I think they're staying the course.
Thank you. So if we turn to the perspective from Japan, how do regional developments look from Japan, and how do you assess the U.S. Japan trade deal and the strategic investment framework, as well as the other deals that were mentioned, like the critical minerals framework and the technology prosperity deal?
I see. Thank you, Christian. First of all, I would like to thank CSIS and the JETRO for this wonderful opportunity. And it's a great honor to, alongside with wonderful fellow panelists. And to many people's eyes, the U.S.-Japan deals looks to help stop the escalation, just stop the situation from escalating into the full scale of the trade war, and that it reduced the uncertainty by locking in a tariff rate in advance. But many conservatives and the business leaders they also view it positively, emphasizing it as a contribution to the stabilizing the U.S.-Japan alliance, and encouraging the Japanese investment in the United States, and strengthening the economic security of the cooperation. That said, we should not overlook the fact that the tariff remains substantially, higher than before, or what it should be. The METI, for example, expects a significant drop in the operating the profit in the auto and the parts the industry, and the auto industry, and including the related sectors, accounts for roughly 8 to 10% of the employment in Japan. The broader economic impact is hard to ignore in Japan, but speaking as a trade law scholar, at the end of the day, I'm a trade law scholar. My bigger concern is a more fundamental, long-term, and institutional. And this type of the bilateral deals undermines the core principle of the international economic order centered on the WTO. Under the current U.S. deal, the United States still imposes the tariffs at least the 15% on the Japanese products, and the rates differs by country. These reciprocal tariffs, plainly the conflict with the U.S. obligation under the WTO agreement, including the MFN and binding of a tariff concession, of course. Then, moreover, as Christie noted in her CSIS report before, this deal may also set a precedent for the broader the framework arrangement, one that links privileged access to the U.S. the market with investment commitment. This is what the Trump administration calls the Turnberry system. In reality, this is a weaponization of the interdependence and especially the market side. shift towards such a a system would mark a departure from the rule-based predictable international trading environment and the movement toward a more power-oriented regime. And because these deals are enforced through the threat of the tariff hike without any independent mechanisms to judge the compliance. In these circumstances, it is hard to claim that the predictability that has been restored. From Japan's point of view, this is a serious issue. Japan runs a very, very extensive global security supply chain through the outside investment and relies heavily on the foreign sources for energy, raw materials, and food. And for Japan, open and rule-based multilateral trading system is not just desirable; it's essential. So regarding the three other agreements, which Christy mentioned, critical minerals and technology prosperities and shipbuilding, they remain abstract. A framework type arrangement. So I don't know. Yet the implementation details. That said, I personally consider the critical minerals agreement especially important. Both Japan and the United States have experienced the Chinese restriction on the rare earth exports, and this is an area where the cooperation really matters. The United States has already concluded a similar kind of the arrangement with Australia, Thailand, and Malaysia. And if these arrangement evolved into the broader network of among the like-minded our countries, they could become an effective means of the countering China's economic coercion.
Yeah. Yes, we've certainly seen a sustained interest in critical minerals from the second Trump administration, and that seems to be an area where we'll see more action in the future. If we look more broadly at the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly zooming in on Southeast Asia, Shay, if I could turn to you, how has Southeast Asia been impacted by these developments, and how are governments and companies reacting?
Okay, great. Thanks, Christy. It's really great to be here this morning, and I'd also add my thanks to CSIS and JETRO for convening this. So I think that there's really three things that are happening at once here. You have this the tariff shock, which Barbara spoke to, that's really changed Southeast Asia's position from one of being a beneficiary of the U.S.-China trade war to now being the target of a broader tariff regime. Then you have new pressures coming from China, and then amidst this, you have governments and companies in Southeast Asia scrambling to try and adjust their strategies. I think in 2025, Southeast Asia has become really the primary battlefield where the Trump administration's trade policy and then Chinese industrial policy are colliding. And Southeast Asia has been caught in the middle, something they, of course, hope to avoid. Now, Southeast Asia being kind of caught in the middle of U.S.-China trade tensions as well as broader geopolitical tensions is nothing new. That's been something that's taken place for some time. But as mentioned, I think what is new is this shift from China-focused tariffs in the first Trump administration to a world where everybody is being forced to pay something. So for really under Trump 1 and the Biden administration, you saw Southeast Asia being a beneficiary. Supply chains moved out of China in large part to avoid these China-specific duties and also to maintain access to the U.S. market. And you saw that reflected in the export numbers and FDI flows, particularly in countries like Vietnam, was a huge beneficiary, as well as Thailand, Malaysia, and some others. With the reciprocal tariff approach, though, that picture has changed. Most of ASEAN countries right now are facing 19% tariffs. Vietnam's facing 20%, and that's come down from initial threats that were much higher. And I'd add to that, as Barbara kind of spoke to, there's there's a much greater focus on economic security concerns, on things like transshipment. And so how have governments responded? I mean, I think initially they've moved very quickly to try and negotiate bilateral deals. They've offered significant concessions and everything from market access to investment commitments. Now, I would note that ASEAN as a grouping has been unable, to mount a collective response, even though there have been some efforts to do so. And so far, you've only actually seen 2 agreements fully concluded, that being Malaysia and Cambodia. You have earlier announcements from Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and some others I think are asking, well, where are they? And there's talk that, they're going to be concluded by the end of this year. But we'll see. I think what's really striking, going back to the economic security commitments, Malaysia and Cambodia, those deals had this economic security alignment, really almost mirroring U.S. policies on a wide range of measures, things like export controls and investment screening and addressing transshipment, et cetera. So, if you look at what's happening in Malaysia, they've seen a lot of domestic criticism over sovereignty concerns on those particular provisions. And I think that from what I'm hearing, it appears to be a major sticking point from some of the other countries in Southeast Asia to conclude these deals. And then add to that, you have the pending IEPA Supreme Court decision, which just injects a whole nother layer of uncertainty for governments and companies. The second major pressure that I mentioned, China's reaction. And I think it's twofold. First, just last week, China publicly weighed in about Malaysia and Cambodia's trade deals. They expressed grave concerns about some certain provisions. I think primarily that some of these economic security provisions or anything that they would see as contrary to China's interests. So I think this places pressure both on those countries in terms of how those provisions are implemented, but even more so, it really serves as a warning shot for some of the other countries about what they should agree to. And then I'd say equally, if not more important, is looking at the surge in Chinese exports to Southeast Asia. They've grown roughly 25% this year, and that's twice the pace of recent years. Set amongst kind of a broader context of Southeast Asia being the largest export market for China since 2023. At the same time, ASEAN exports into China have grown much more slowly. So you see that taking place. Now, a lot of these are components that are feeding ASEAN's own export industries, but there's a whole flood of cheap final goods, consumer products, and electric vehicles, other things that are of concern to economies in Southeast Asia. And it's also displacing some of ASEAN's exports to third country markets. So, governments have responded with some piecemeal defenses, but I think are still very much struggling with this and looking at kind of the fact that ASEAN manufacturers are going to need to upgrade their competitiveness or really risk being squeezed out. So, I just conclude by saying that I think all of this means that the watchword this year in Southeast Asia and many places has been diversify, 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 diversify. ASEAN continues to deepen ties with China. They just signed the upgrade to their the ASEAN-China free trade area, but countries are aggressively looking beyond both the U.S. and China, accelerating negotiations with the EU, the GCC, joining BRICS, trying to leverage and enhance the implementation of RCEP. And then just last month, you had a new dialogue that was launched between ASEAN and the CPTPP countries. I think companies are also trying to do the same thing, kind of moving from this China plus one strategy to a bit more of a survival strategy, trying to localize their supply chains to satisfy the U.S., but also really trying to remain flexible enough to pivot as amidst like a very quickly moving strategy. So I would just finally say that the region is looking for stability and As noted earlier, I think Japan does offer that, and so I think Japan really has an opportunity to play a critical role here in working with Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure we'll come back to the theme of economic security again in just a moment and go a little bit deeper. But yeah, I think that building on Barbara's point about the clear break, I think for Southeast Asia, the economic security conversation used to be about diversifying away from China into Southeast Asia. And now, of course, U.S. actions have made it clear that diversification needs to be much more broad-based from different sources, not just China, also from the U.S., but then also the political imperatives that you have to consider with your partners. So a very difficult balancing act for these countries. So then turning to Rob, what have been the major developments in terms of technology and innovation policy, which has been a big part of the conversations for the last year in various ways? It's woven itself into the fabric of these narratives. And then, again, kind of trying to draw in a little bit of the private sector perspective. Where does that fit into this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I always get asked that question, but the fun question is the bigger question. So I'm going to answer that first, and then I'll answer that. So I think it's really important to understand that there's a great saying by Herb Stein, a Nixon advisor: if it can't go on forever, it won't. And there's simply no way the U.S. massive trade deficit could go on forever. It just won't. It can't. As recently as 3 or 4 years ago, the U.S. accounted for between 70 and 80% of all global trade deficits. Take all the global trade deficits, we accounted for 70 to 80% of them. That's not sustainable. At some point, that has to stop. It could stop with a dollar collapse. Trump didn't want it. They still bizarrely defend a strong dollar. Don't ask me why. And so ultimately, we have to have global rebalancing. That's number one. And the idea that countries, including Japan, is upset about that, I understand why you're upset about it. But the reality is it couldn't keep going on. It just can't. You can argue, as we would argue, that the way that Trump administration has proceeded to fix that problem isn't the right way, but it was a problem that needed to be fixed. Second point is we hear about violating the WTO. I don't think we live in that world anymore. The place where the WTO was violated, and we have to remember that every single day, it was China. They systematically violated the WTO since the day they joined. Under the WTO rules, there is no way that you can require technology transfer as a share of as a condition of market access. Go ask Kawasaki how that worked out for them with high-speed rail. And also under the WTO rules, you cannot weaponize your exports. How did that work out with rare earth exports to Japan about a decade ago? So I hate the term the U.S.-China trade war. When we were in the conflict with the Soviet Union, we never talked about I hope we didn't, the U.S.-Soviet challenge. We talked about the West, or the democratic nations' challenge against the Soviets. The U.S. isn't fighting this battle for ourselves. It's fighting as a proxy battle for you, for the Europeans, for the Commonwealth countries, for everybody. It's China that has weaponized trade. It's China that, in a recent report we wrote about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, that what China is trying to do is dominate global, what we call national power industries, industries that give you power. So who cares about perfume, T-shirts, baseball gloves? Have nothing to do with national power. But certainly AI, quantum, aerospace, biotechnology, telecom equipment, all of these things enable national power. Even if they're not directly in the defense sphere, they're in the dual use sphere. So I think that's what we have to sort of understand, and that gets us to this next step, which is where do we go? And I think we fundamentally have to say that it was a beautiful vision, this utopian Francis Fukuyama vision, Tom Friedman vision. If we all had McDonald's, there's no more war. Sounds like something out of John Lennon. Imagine a world with all McDonald's. Well, I think China has McDonald's, and I think Taiwan has McDonald's, and who knows? So I think we have to come to the realization that we have to postpone that vision until China becomes democratic. because they're not going to change what they want. And what they want, in my view, is they want to be the global hegemon, not only from a power, sort of national power perspective, but from a techno-economic power perspective. And then that's what you see that in what they're doing. They're spending, Chinese government is spending more money on quantum R&D than every government in the world combined. They built 34 electric vehicle cargo ships recently in 1 year. The typical, we were building 2 a year in the world. They built 34. So you just see that they're building more nuclear power plants than all the rest of the world combined. They installed more robots than all the rest of the world combined. And they're not doing that, and a good example now is COMAC. COMAC is in their state-owned enterprise for commercial passenger jets. They are selling jets through the ASEAN region. They're expanding their production. And the only reason they're doing that, like, let's be honest, only reason they're doing that is because of forced technology transfer and massive subsidies from the government. That company would not exist without that. This is not market forces we're talking about. So I think, to the point being, I think we have to just sort of get rid of this notion of trade partnerships and instead think about strategic partnerships. I was on a panel yesterday where mostly Europeans, and I said, I thought that the biggest place the first place the U.S. ideally should look for a strategic partnership is with Europe, but that's not going to happen because the Europeans, I can't use the language I want to use, but let's just say they're not oriented to that. So I said the second best is Japan, because I think there is a real opportunity for strategic national power trade partnerships with Japan. And I think a core component of that has to be around technology. And what's frustrating, and not certainly nuclear, certainly chips, the 2 nanometer partnership is super important. There's so many areas where you have strengths that are complementary to our strengths and vice versa. Sort of one simple one is sort of hardware, software. But I'll just close by saying it's frustrating to me hearing all this stuff but not seeing it operationalized. And I think that we're now at that next phase. Let's operationalize that. Let's figure out how the U.S. federal labs can be structured to make partnerships with a group like NEDO super easy. Like, oh, we're doing a partnership. Let's do it with Argonne National Labs and NEDO. Let's just easy to do that. Easy for people to move back and forth, easy to sign MOUs. And we should be thinking about that, in my opinion. Same thing with NSF and the Japanese equivalent. We should be able to fund NSF projects, National Science Foundation projects, that include Japanese PIs and U.S. PIs and vice versa. So I get what I'd like to see both sides do is to start putting these things on paper so that when people on the ground want to implement them, there's an easy path forward. And maybe you've done that. I don't know what Japan has done, but I certainly know that we haven't done that yet, although people are talking about it. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. We have a lot on the table, but to come back and maybe build on this topic of economic security that is kind of manifested in various ways in speakers' comments. Obviously, it's going to be a big part of our discussions going forward. The definition of economic security is shifting all the time, and we see some definitions differ certainly across different countries. And even in the national security strategy that was released just last week, we saw economic security feature prominently. So maybe to build on Rob's comments about trying to think about how countries can move together on this, if we think about the U.S. Japan strategic investment framework, for example, maybe turning to Tsuyoshi, it specifies that this Japanese investment will be directed towards sectors that are more important to advancing economic and security interests like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, metals, critical minerals, shipbuilding, energy, et cetera, AI and quantum. So, where do we see opportunities here to move forward in some of these areas?
Oh, talking to me?
Yes. Obviously, we don't expect you to answer it, but if you have some ideas on that.
Yeah, I have some idea. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that I see a critical mineral is the most urgent and strategically, important area for United States and Japan cooperation. But if I had to, name, another one, it would be the semiconductor, of course. Don't you think so? No? Well, both, the Biden and the Trump administration, have been trying to boost the domestic, the production of the advanced chips. But simply, bringing a company like the TSMC isn't, enough. You need to the entire ecosystem, not just, the factories, but also the design tools and the materials, and manufacturing and the inspection of the equipment. So, and to be honest, trying to internalize the entire ecosystem inside the United States or inside one country, it just isn't, realistic, either financially and technologically. So that's why, the only, practical path forward to build the supply chain across the trustworthy, the countries that specialize that in a different stage of the production, equipment or materials, what people now call the friendshoring. Ideally, a framework similar to the Biden administration, the Chips for Initiative, would be developed among Japan and United States, Taiwan, and the South Korea. And maybe, the Southeast Asian countries, economies, that are strong in back end, the process. And it shouldn't, just about the supply chain, it should also cover the technology cooperation, the subsidy, and the export controls, of course. And having said that, we also have to be realistic. And South Korea reportedly faced a strong pressure from China and found it difficult to fully join Chips for Initiative. So we may well encounter the similar kind of political constraints again.
Rob, to come back to you briefly, you were talking about your recent work about the U.S. needing a transformative national power industry strategy for the future, one that goes beyond mere competitiveness or innovation. So you started to talk at the end of your comments about a role for Japan and perhaps other countries in this. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about, do you see some of these new investments perhaps flowing into some of these areas and building into those, into this kind of vision, or how would you see that moving forward?
Yeah, I think the number one point is, and it's really hard for countries like Japan who've had such a really rich tradition of sophisticated industrial strategy. I say that in the best possible way because there's so many people in Washington who are like, oh, METI was a failure, and like, whatever, yeah, don't get me started. We don't have that tradition. Well, we have that tradition, but we lost it in the 70s. We actually used to have the ability to. So one of the things that I'm not sure the U.S. is going to be able to embrace this, what you might call a Friedrich List strategy of national developmentalism and focusing on particular industries. We do it at best by happenstance. Japan has done it, and my understanding is METI's involved in doing that right now. So I hope that we start developing more sophisticated capabilities to do that. I think the best place, the most likely place for that to happen would be in the Defense Department, if they can expand out their focus on, which is pretty narrow, on defense industries to broader dual use. If we could do that, then I think what we need to talk about next would be to say, let's identify 4 or 5 key industries and think about what a joint strategy would look like. So semiconductors would be one. I think machine tools and robotics is another one where Japan has real strengths. And I hate to oversimplify, we're pretty good actually at software and robotics, and you're good at that too, but really good at the hardware side. So I think it'd be really great to have a test case where we, jointly work together for 12 months to operationalize what would a joint strategy look like in semiconductors. What are all the things we need to do? As you pointed out, it's testing, it's materials, it's whole set of things. It's not just the final fab of a small nanometer chip. So I think that would be useful, and I think DoD probably could take the lead on our end and METI on your end, and begin to really delve down together. And that's something that, as far as I can tell, we've never done that before. We've always thought about this as ourselves, and the reason why that's important is I really strongly believe that if you want to call it the West, which would include Japan and Korea and Taiwan, but obviously Europe and the Commonwealth countries, at one level, I don't care who's good at robotics. I just want somebody to be good at it that's not China, because we can't let China dominate that. Or same thing with telecom equipment. Fine, let the Europeans do it with Ericsson and Nokia, a little bit of Samsung. Doesn't matter to me, really. It's just somebody has to do it. And so I think that is the way we should be thinking about that. Now, obviously, the U.S. shouldn't just give up on things, but technology is so complex and so expensive today that no country can do it by themselves. The Chinese actually might be the exception to that because they're able to just pour so much money into it. But the U.S. no longer has that capability, so it means that we've got a little bit of specialization that we have to do, and then collaboration to let the dollars go further.
Barbara, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything that you said, but I think that there's a really important point that needs to be made here, an asterisk to everything that you're saying. Everything that the administration has done since it came into office has been to undermine the partnerships that it's built with all of these countries. The trust has been eroded completely.
Sure.
So now we're saying we're America first some days, but some days we want the partnerships. Some days we want kind of an order, but other days, we want to lead. And the truth is, for many years, the U.S. had an approach and other countries followed, but they followed because we brought them along and because we respected their interests. And we have been sending such mixed signals to our partners right now that I wonder, even for a country like Japan, with which we have a close partnership going back many, many decades, most important relationship bar none, what happens if the 232 on, say, pharmaceuticals that's due out any second includes Japan? Or what happens if, on any of these semiconductor issues or any of the other 232s, that they are not excluded or not given some sort of special treatment? So I think that the partnerships are really important. And if the priority is to be able to compete and to have the West work together to address what we see as an existential threat, then we need to shift our approach to build that trust that's going to be needed to be able to achieve the kind of goals that you're talking about.
And then Shay, if I could turn to you and build on that. I mean, if those dynamics are true, even with a country like Japan, where there is a large amount of shared interests and a relationship of long trust in many cases, what about in Southeast Asia, where there are much more varied relationships with the U.S.? What do you see as the potential for working together on economic security now? You've said that this is very contentious in some of these new trade agreements where, it's been baked in these ways and that China has reacted, et cetera. But what does that conversation look like for, potential counterparts in Southeast Asia looking at the U.S. and these conversations?
First of all, and this is, most people probably know this, but I mean, Southeast Asia is known for being very, very pragmatic, and I think will really be trying to navigate and figure out how to make this new environment work for them and their businesses. That said, economic security, is as a concept is not kind of looked at in the same way in Southeast Asia. Japan for years has been working on developing their policies and strategy on economic security. The U.S., Korea, other countries have really been looking at this. Most countries in Southeast Asia, that's really not the case. So I think it's something where the approach needs to be very, very different and look for things that are both impactful for actual U.S. economic security, as well as that's kind of politically, doable. I think that's where some of the provisions in the current agreements have gotten so much backlash because it's basically, in many cases, saying that these countries will adopt U.S. policy on many of these issues. That said, I mean, I think if you're looking from Malaysia's perspective, there was a lot of wiggle room, if you will, about how that's actually implemented. And I expect that I would be surprised to see Malaysia just kind of taking lock, stock, and barrel the various policies of the U.S. So, anyways, I think that it's something where you can only bring some of these countries along so far. I think you have to try and find, again, meaningful areas that can really move the needle, and I think there can be there can be momentum and things accomplished, but I think we have to just look at it from a little bit of a different lens from some of the partnerships with countries like Japan.
Important to think about is, many of these economic security issues can't be solved by bilateral cooperation, et cetera. They need to be much larger coalitions, but then they have these varying perspectives that will be challenging to navigate. So if we think about, there was an obvious, sort of debate brewing among the panelists about the future of the institutions of trade, the WTO, all of these things. These are the big questions that we're facing on a practical sense about how to build a predictable investment environment for companies, et cetera, and to facilitate trade. But then, also there's a lot of other concerns baked in. So if we try to tackle that here, what do we think the future should look like for trade institutions? We could think, pragmatically about expanding CPTPP membership. We've heard the WTO discussed as perhaps, a very important thing to tackle revitalizing, or perhaps something that should be postponed till a much further date in the future after much more pragmatic steps have been taken. Obviously, WTO disagreements have been brewing for decades, and there are a lot of problems with the institution that I think all countries acknowledge need to be solved. So is that something that's worth devoting attention to now? I've heard other people talk about a revised or a adapted IPEF that could be put forward, or perhaps a totally new structure, or maybe we're just back to bilaterals, for the future. But if we try to think about it, a little bit at a more of a bird's eye view, what can we say about trade architecture in this kind of a political environment? And, is it possible to design some kind of a more future-oriented, realistic economic framework that can help us to ensure stable trade in this kind of environment? Difficult question, but maybe, Tsuyoshi, do you want to try first?
Yes, right. Let's talk about the Japanese leadership. In this respect, I believe the Takaichi administration is ready to take that responsibility. Prime Minister Takaichi will inherit the policy orientation of the Abe administration. Japan will continue to serve a flag bearer, leader of the free trade, supporting an open and global trading system. This is already evident from her the policy address to the Diet in October. The key point is very simple. With or without United States, most of America's trading partners have no choice but to operate within the rule-based open multilateral trading system. Japan is no exception, as I mentioned earlier. Let me highlight, several examples. The first, the policy address, that I mentioned, identifies the strategic enlargement of the CPTPP. That is very, that's crucial, to the Japan, and this is our top priority, right? And within the CPTPP, we are seeing the substantial, the progress in the accession process of the Indonesia and the Philippines, and two of the major, ASEAN economics. So, it is very, clear, that the CPTPP will be the focal point of the future, or the institution of the global trading system. The second, now, EU took part in the TPP committee in Melbourne in November, and both sides reaffirmed, their commitment to rule-based trading system and agreed to continue working closely, with the CPTPP, while a formal EU accession is quite unlikely in the short term. It's going to be a very, very difficult job. But cooperation in the key areas such as digital trade and supply chain and WTO reform maybe is likely to deepen. So Japan is expected to play a leadership role in this the process. Takaichi also praised Japan's active contribution to WTO reform at G20 at the Johannesburg the summit in November. And in addition, Japan hosted the TICAD 9 in Yokohama in August, where it announced the establishment of the expert committee to explore the FTA with American partners. So far, Japan never concluded, the FTA with African country. So I'm not sure, which country is going to be the first one. And finally, Japan's business society, including Keidanren, started to voice necessity for the Japan-Mercosur FTA. So this, we have many options, to establish the future design of the multilateral or regional trading system.
Well, it's good to hear that Japan is thinking about taking up a leadership mantle. I think many countries will be hoping that that is what happens. Maybe I could turn to Barbara. Do you have some thoughts about this?
Yeah. First, I want to say that those of us in the U.S. that worked on TPP were eternally grateful to Japan for continuing the negotiations and concluding the CPTPP. Although I don't love the name, we're really glad that you concluded the agreement and think it was really important. In terms of just where we go from here and whether or not the U.S. is even interested in building some sort of new economic order, as Ishiguro-san said, I think that is a question right now, and it's not clear that there's interest in doing anything other than bilateral work. Now, I want to say that over the course of trade history, I always tell people we were all multilateral until the late 80s, early 90s. Then we were all into bilateral, and then around in the early 2000s, we realized that bilateral agreements were too slow. They were creating a spaghetti bowl of rules. They were not advancing common rules that were in the interest of our in our economic interests, so that we needed to build a more regional economic structure. Now we're back to bilateral. And I think ultimately we will see the need to build something more regional, whether it's because of challenges posed by China or because we need to have common rules, that we will ultimately see some opportunities. Now that may start out being sectoral because doing something larger may be more than we can bite off at this point. But I do think that, on whether it's sort of economic security adjacent type issues or other economic issues that, digital or something, that we will look to see if there are opportunities to do that over time. In terms of, other countries going forward, I don't think that seems to be bothering anybody in this administration, that other countries continue to be strongly supportive of global trade arrangements and don't, at least at this point, see it as any kind of particular challenge. But then I think the question arises, would the U.S. at some point in the future look to join CPTPP if that is the most advanced trade agreement? And I guess what I would say is it's extremely difficult for the United States to be able to accede to what is then another agreement. But I've, of course, spent a lot of time thinking about this question, and I do think that there are ways to do this. There are issues that are not part of CPTPP, that were never part of any trade agreement, that have to do with economic security. We never talked about export controls, investment. None of that was ever part of the trade landscape, and we actually were not allowed to be talking about any of those issues. Now they're all on the table. So I think it creates opportunities to move to trying to find a way to bring the United States back in at some point in the future. And I think there will be, the pendulum, I think, will swing.
Rob, can I turn to you next?
So I think there's a question of should and there's a question of is. So I'll tell you my should and then I'll tell you my is. What I think we should do is we should keep the WTO. It has its role. And for example, ITA and Information Technology Agreement, the next round of that needs to happen. Japan has been great on that. Thank you. I think e-commerce moratorium, in theory, you could talk about an environmental goods and services agreement. Those are all useful. That's a nice venue for that. Not everybody's going to play, but enough will play that it makes a difference. But I think the WTO as a straitjacket is no longer valid. It just can't do that. And so I think what we should do is think about sort of like a Russian doll, a three-tier type of trade agreements or partnership. And one would be an agreement with like-minded countries, and again, I would put Japan as numero uno, where we basically bring in a lot of things into the table. We bring in export controls. We bring in what I think we should also do is import controls. So we jointly don't allow Chinese imports that are made unfairly or with stolen IP. We do commercial counterintelligence sharing. We do technology partnership. It's not just about let's get our tariffs to zero and we're done. I think it's a much more integrated and deep partnership. And I think we should do that. I think there's a bunch of countries that would be willing to join together to do that. And if you do that, what's the advantage? Well, then there's zero tariffs. There's zero trade barriers between us. It's like it goes back to that, kind of ideal nirvana. Then I think there are these sort of second-tier place countries that they're not willing to do that, but they're okay, they're close. So you kind of get more generalized open market access. And then there's the third tiers like China, where we're not going to, I don't think we should have open trade with China. I don't think we should have open investment with China. There's systematic cheaters, and we just have to realize that. Now, if they were to change, okay, let's revisit it. So I think we're going to end up, now, what are we going to do? I don't think we're going to do that in the Trump administration. I think there are too many pure, sort of autarkic thinkers in the administration that, that literally have said to me, the U.S. market is so big that we can take advantage of. I mean, the theory, historical economic theory for trade was partly related to economies of scale. Companies needed global markets to get needed economies of scale. There are people in the administration who believe that doesn't really matter anymore because the U.S. economy is so big, there's no industry, there's no firm that can't get all of its economies of scale. Well, that's simply not true. I mean, I'm going to take Boeing. Boeing can't survive on the U.S. market. Microsoft can't survive. NVIDIA can't survive. Merck, and Amgen can't survive. So I think in this administration, we'll get marginal changes. I think they want to, use the hammer and get a lot of, and maybe, hopefully, we'll switch over. I think it's possible that a next Republican administration could become more sophisticated and think this way. I think a Democratic administration, who knows? I mean, you could get as Jason Oxman said yesterday at the Washington International Trade Association, said the Biden administration should have done a Elon Musk Doge and gotten rid of the word T in USTR. Because they didn't do anything on trade. So it's not clear to me whether we're going to have a repeat of sort of Bidenism, which is let's take a pause, which really was, we've got to remember that. They were almost as they weren't as protectionist, but they were almost as isolationist as the Trump administration. They did not like trade. They really didn't, because the unions didn't like trade. So it's possible you could get another Democrat like that, or you could get a more moderate Democrat in the kind of tradition of maybe Clinton, who thinks, no, we've got to Bill Clinton in that case. You really got to go out and build these agreements. So we just don't know what's going to happen to where either party is going to go.
Lots to think about there. So Che, I'm going to give you an opportunity to weigh in, and then I'm going to open up to the audience for questions. So please think about what you like to ask to our fantastic panel.
All right, great. Yeah, no, I just had a couple of points to add on there. I think a lot of interesting comments. First of all, sitting here in Washington, I think we need to remember that, and this is quite aside from the WTO discussions, but there is a lot of activity happening on the trade front in Asia and in other places. So at Asia Society, we have a tracker that looks at this, and it's really quite significant, including Japan, of course. So I think we shouldn't forget that. Second, if you talk about U.S. trade policy, a U.S. economic engagement, and maybe a new economic framework towards the region, we have to remember that these countries have really been burned twice, I would say, by CPTPP and then IPEF, which many put quite a bit into. So asking them to kind of come to the table again, I think would take some convincing. In terms of though where we are, where we might see some progress. I agree with Barbara. I think that there could be some support for sectoral agreements. Both USTR has made some comments on that front. There certainly has been some support from Republicans on Capitol Hill for specific sectoral agreements. So I think that is something that might get traction even under this administration. But and one other thing I'd just note to really pay attention to is the USMCA review that's coming up, and that just had a hearing last week. This is really the first opportunity for Congress to affirmatively weigh in. They're part of the process. So, while the administration has been putting forward their trade policy, we haven't actually seen any any real congressional activity. So where does the actual political support lie? And I think I just conclude by saying for any really robust future economic framework, I think we need to see a political change on how trade is thought about, and that could happen. I mean, what came after Smoot-Hawley? You see, Roosevelt came in and had a whole different approach. So I think it depends on politically how the Trump administration's trade policy is viewed. Is it viewed as something successful that, or does there end up being some backlash towards some of these policies? In which case, you might see a reimagining or a whole different vision that's quite different from where we are today.
Thank you. So I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. If we have any brave souls who'd like to ask anything. If you do, please wait for the mic to come to you, and then please identify yourself before asking your question. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Isla Lumberry. I'm a graduate student in democracy and governance at Georgetown University. My question is, how can Japan and some of these other democratic Western powers incentivize meaningful innovation in some of these critical industries that keeps pace with China, but still in a democratic, free market way that upholds the economic security framework, especially given this current climate where some of those longstanding norms are being challenged with the U.S. centralizing decisions over trade policy, tariffs in the hands of the executive. Thank you.
Takers on that?
I think that's to you.
Rob, perhaps? How to incentivize innovation by companies in a democratic way?
So I think one of the big mistakes that I think the U.S. makes, and this is across the political spectrum, but largely it's the fault of economists. I blame economists and lawyers for most of the problems in the world. And it's a joke. But there's this view, and it's almost this hubris in the U.S., that there's only one recipe for innovation, and it's the U.S. recipe. And the U.S. recipe is pretty good. It's not perfect. But there are multiple recipes for innovation. And one recipe, you could say, is more where the state plays a stronger role, kind of in the middle, if you will. Maybe I might put Japan in that role, I put Korea in that role, I put Taiwan in that role. And then there's a much more heavy-handed approach, which I would put in the Chinese category. So I think the U.S. has to adopt a more middle approach. And I think the CHIPS and Science Act, unfortunately, was not funded as what it should be. But in spirit, the CHIPS and Science Act to me was an important turning point in how the U.S. envisioned innovation policy, a much more active role. It wasn't picking, it really wasn't picking individual winners like, we're going to pick Intel, but Micron, now forget Micron, it's only Intel. We didn't do that. We just said we think this set of technologies of processing and memory is important. So I think we got to do that more. I think, for example, we need a national motor vehicle strategy. And that's another area where I think Japan and the U.S. could work collaboratively. I mean, China is just, oh my gosh. I mean, they're able to produce this particular car. I drove it, a BYD car for $8,000. It's a pretty darn good car. And the Chinese automobile productivity now, at least a recent study I saw, I don't know how good it is, but it said the Chinese automobile labor productivity is equal to Detroit labor productivity. And their wages are 30%. So they suppress their wages. I mean, historically, the relationship between wages and productivity in developing countries is linear. Everybody says, oh, we can't compete with low-wage countries. Of course we can. They have low productivity. They have low wages. They have low productivity. No problem. The Chinese have decided to break that pattern. So because of that, I think it really means the government needs to be more thoughtful, work more with industry. I think NSF, for example, they created this thing called the TIP, a Technology Innovation Partnerships Program under the Science Act. It's hardly gotten any money, but the whole idea there was to focus on 10 important technologies for our future and really work with industry. So I think we should do things like that. We have an anemic research and development tax credit in the country. We rank 28th out of 34 countries. Chinese R&D credit is 4 times more generous than ours. So I think you could do lots of things like that isn't deeply interventionist and distortive. It's just saying we're going to kind of rev up our innovation system engine and make it easier for companies to innovate. And I think a key part of that is Japanese companies in the U.S. should be able to take advantage of that as long as we have reciprocality. American companies in Japan can take advantage. I think that's the way we should be thinking about that. But I think this sort of notion that we're free market and we're hands off, we never were. Look, the reason the U.S. leads in technology, last thing I'll say, the reason the U.S. leads in technology is because we spent more on R&D. The government spent more on R&D in the 50s and 60s than every other country combined, government and business R&D combined. Take every company in the world outside the U.S., you take every government outside the world in the U.S. government spent more. And that was NASA, and it was defense to challenge the Soviets. That gave us such an enormous lead. And so the idea that somehow Silicon Valley was created on the backs of entrepreneurs, that's nonsense. Of course entrepreneurs played a key role, but the biggest funder in Silicon Valley in Santa Clara County in 1992 was the Defense Department. So we just have to remember that's our tradition, and we shouldn't be rejecting it. So I think we should be doing a lot more of that. I don't know that we will. I think the Trump administration is largely what I would call small government protectionists. They wanted to get rid of the CHIPS Act. Now they can't get rid of it, so they're taking equity positions. But they want to put up a trade wall, and that's their idea. And they've actually said this publicly. They think it's easier than a competitive strategy. Competitive strategy is hard. I get it. So let's do the simple thing and just put up tariffs. The problem with tariffs is they alienate our friends and they alienate our allies, and ultimately that's a losing proposition. And it doesn't get you what you want in terms of innovation.
We have time for perhaps one more question.
Thank you. My name is Kazuo Waki, a graduate student at the International Economic Policy Program at George Washington University. I think my question is related to technology cooperation, partly covering the panel discussions, and I think there is discussions about joint technology research between U.S. and Japan. That would be a potential idea, but I think the other important pillar of technology cooperation would be technological standardizations, which Japan is increasingly proactive recently, and its importance is really clear given its implications in innovations, and also it has an economic security implications. China is also pushing forward internationalization of Chinese standardizations. And given these circumstances, I want to ask how you kind of evaluate the current status of technology cooperation between U.S. and Japan, particularly for standardizations. I think Japan published its standardizations strategies this year. I know some unilateral, some effort in each country, but I'm just wondering what's going on in bilateral cooperations on these issues, particularly for the sakes of technology innovation in these countries.
A question about bilateral standards cooperation between the U.S. and Japan, or perhaps more broadly, if any speakers want to take it.
Can you clarify what kind of standards?
What kind of standards are you particularly interested in?
It's basically technology standardizations, but stuff like telecommunications, AI standards, like some rule-making regarding those issues.
So the question is particularly referring to standards around AI, telecommunications, things like this. So.
I mean, I can just say, first of all, looking at the technology prosperity agreement, that this was a component of it, and looking kind of through the Southeast Asia lens and thinking about areas for cooperation. When I worked in Southeast Asia, that was always an area where I thought that we could do more. The U.S. did do some work with ASEAN and then with specific countries on trying to develop standards. There's work within APEC and other places on standards, but I think in many ways you see the way that standards play out, which it can seem like a little bit of like a dry topic, but the implications are enormous in terms of the whether it's hardware or also software and AI. Right now, it's a huge deal. I mean, on AI, you've seen Singapore do a lot of work in this area and try and build some AI principles within the ASEAN context. So I think that as leaders, the U.S. and Japan could do a lot of work together. It may also be a potentially kind of less challenging or controversial area for that, because I think, at least with Japan and the U.S., I think there's a lot of alignment, whereas there's some real differences with both the EU and then China in a major way. And you do see China throughout a lot of standards bodies in the world putting a lot of resources and effort into shaping those. So it's important to have a voice, as I said, especially when new standards with new developing technologies are taking place to make sure to have an active voice. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add. But
I would just add, for a long, long time, U.S. industry wanted China to participate in the global standards process, which is voluntary, industry-led. Because before that, it was the Chinese government, MIIT and others, they sort of imposing these bizarre Chinese standards and enforcing them. And now they got their wish. Unfortunately, maybe they should have kept it in the first place, because what the Chinese do now is they basically flood the zone of these international standards bodies, which are voluntary and sort of one person, one vote. And the Chinese go there, they get 500 votes. I mean, I'm exaggerating. And the other thing the Chinese do, which is really nefarious, is they force their companies to align on one position. We don't do that, and I don't believe Japan does that. We'll have 5 companies here fighting for this standard and 5 companies here fighting for this standard. Chinese don't do that. So I think we have to, again, this would be one of these partnership things. I think we got to come up with how do we counter that? We cannot let China dominate technical standard setting because they're doing it to advantage their firms. Not to say that every standard they come up with is bad, I'm not saying that, but we have to figure out a way to make the international technical standards process more fair and more representative of the process it's been, which is industries fighting it out, so it's kind of like let the best standard win. And that's generally what's happened, but the Chinese are changing that.
Barbara, Tsuyoshi, any last thoughts? Well, it's been an incredibly rich discussion. I think that we managed to get a picture of where things are in terms of evolving policy. A lot of challenges out there, maybe some opportunities as well, but those are clearly still being understood and shaped in various ways. So thank you to our fantastic panelists for sharing your perspectives and to everyone who is able to join us today. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.